Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Scepter of Flint by N.L. Holmes, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. Hemmed in by an enormous crowd, Hani stood between the lion-bodied images of the king that flanked the main street of Akhenaten. He was waiting, as it seemed he had so often in the last 7 years, for the king and his family to make their appearance. This occasion was the opening ceremony of the Great Jubilee of the Aten. More splendid than even the 2 previous jubilees Neferkheperra had held since he'd come to the throne alone, this one had been 2 years in the making. All the ambassadors of foreign lands, all the mayors of Kemet's vassal states to the north, and all the princes of Tennessee to the south were there to render homage, because Neferkheperra was the Aten. Officially, he was the sun and the only priest of the shining sun disk, but Hani had realized long ago that, in fact, the king in his person was intended to be the revelation of the Aten. One God, one priest, one revelation. Him. Hani ground his teeth at the very thought of Neferkheperra's theology. Had the king no idea of the havoc his decrees had wrought? The Ipit Isut, the greatest of shrines, consecrated to Amun-Ra, had been closed, the cult statues desecrated, the priests expelled. The Hidden One's estates had been confiscated, and tens of thousands of priests and workers had found themselves without jobs. Had the king held his celebration in the old capital, Wasit, this crowd would have been dangerously hostile. But the inhabitants of Akhenaten were hand-picked. They were the bureaucrats and tradespeople for whom the king's continued favor had been more important than conscience, and they would applaud him as he demanded. Yet here I am too, Hani thought with a twinge of cynicism. And here is my father, and here are my sons and daughter and son-in-law. Nub-Nefer, his wife, had been obdurate enough in her faith to refuse 12 to attend. Sadhat-Hura, Hani's middle girl, had yielded to her mother's stern orders and declined to participate as well. Hani mopped his forehead. The temperature wasn't extreme in this second month of the winter season. Still, packed in with a dense crowd of perspiring bodies, he was none too comfortable as sweat dampened his armpits and then chilled. The men around him were like him, scribes and emissaries in the king's foreign office. His friend Maine was at his side, bouncing on his tiptoes, trying to see over the taller heads around him. "I should be like a crocodile," Maine shouted over the rumble of the crowd. "They keep growing as long as they live. I'd be taller than Kalia by now." Kalia was their mutual friend, the ambassador from Naharan. Hani laughed. He was of average height and still could see nothing more than the white-clad backs of his colleagues, the linen shirts growing transparent with perspiration. Everyone's big court wigs blocked even more of his view. He wondered if Maya, his son-in-law and secretary, could see anything at all. Hani eyed the bright, clear sky overhead, blue as turquoise, soft and smooth as the breast of a heron. Great Ra, he prayed silently, put an end to this madness. A hawk sailed overhead far, far into the cloudless azure distance, and Hani followed it admiringly with squinted eyes. Perhaps it was a magnificent bird, or perhaps it was the god Haru, watching the 2 lands with an all-seeing and protective gaze. "Lord Haru, show us the way of truth," Hani sighed. He heard a scuffling noise ahead of him, and suddenly 2 men lurched back into the crowd, one of them looking blanched and unwell, leaning on his anxious companion's arm. They forced their way through the throng, and Hani and Maine found themselves pressed forward into the front rank of the spectators. "We can breathe at last," he said to Maine with a grin. The great processional way stretched off before him in either direction, and the crowd of bureaucrats, a bright white and black fringe bordering the tall, whitewashed walls of temple and palace and sparkling with festive gold jewelry. Banners rippled lazily in the scant wind. The sun-scorched street had been swept and the dust held back by a sprinkling of water, but still it reflected the glare until it was almost impossible to see without a visoring hand. Somewhere to Hani's right, toward the palace, were the viziers and upper-level functionaries like his own superior, Lord Patames, High Commissioner of Northern Foreign Relations. To his left stood the lower-rank royal scribes and military scribes, including his sons and father. All at once, trumpets began to bray, chiming in one after the other in a joyous ascending chord. The crowd rustled and murmured excitedly. Around the north wall of the palace, the royal procession came into view. First, several army units marching in step to the beat of drums, and then the royal family. The king and queen were borne high in their golden carrying chairs on the shoulders of stalwarts decked in plumes and leopard skins. Neferkapura gazed straight ahead of him, a slight smile on his lips, and so did the beautiful Neferidi Nefernufuratn. They were a splendid couple, Hani had to admit, and things had reached such a pass in his soul that even that admission was painful. But they were young and good-looking, although the king had begun to grow fat like his father. Decked with jewels, they crossed arms bearing the crook and flail of kingship. They sparkled like the pair of gods they were. Behind them, the royal daughters were borne aloft, pretty girls with shaved heads and the lock of childhood, several of them already adolescent. The crown prince, the Haru in the nest, who was only 2, was carried in his nurse's arms, and other members of the dynasty, the queen mother and more of her children, followed. Clouds of flower petals and bits of fine gold leaf fountained into the air as they passed, tossed by enthusiastic naked children with baskets. The crowd roared its approval, and many spectators lunged forward to collect the falling gold, but soldiers stationed every few cubits held them back with lowered spears. "Our king does love a spectacle," Maine shouted at Hani, grinning broadly. 2 magnificently dressed servants waved dyed ostrich plume flabella at either side of the king and queen, and behind the royal carrying chairs marched the king's special friends, the fan-bearers, each with a single plume on a golden handle. If real public servants were rewarded as they should be, Ptolemy's would be among them, thought Hani bitterly. But in fact, his superior had been stripped of his high offices and even of his status of royal friend because he had dared to stand up to the young king when Neferkapura had been his father's co-regent. And now the viziers were passing. Lord Apparel, Hani's higher superior, with his chiseled pale northern face, and his southern counterpart, Lord Nakpa-Aten, whom Hani knew but slightly. The higher echelon of bureaucrats was peeling off from the crowd to join the procession, and Ptolemy's was in there somewhere. Hani thought he saw his head rising taller than the others at the far edge of the group. Before long, Hani and Maine took their places in line. The cadence of the drums pounded in his viscera as he began to walk. "I can't wait until this is over," Hani thought glumly. 5 days after the opening ceremony of the Great Jubilee, Hani reached Wasset, where he defiantly maintained his residence. "Well, my love, how did it go?" Nub-Nefer asked her husband as they embraced. "Spectacular, as always," he said, bending to smell the perfume rising from her warm natural hair. "I don't know how he has time to do anything but parade around." She sneered and gave a snort. Nub-Nefer was violently opposed to Neferkapura, who was the sworn enemy of the Hidden One, Amun-Ra. The king had cost her family their positions as hereditary priests. "There are no longer any festivals of the gods to preside over. What else has he to do?" She looked up at Hani wistfully. "Do you have to go back?" "Not until the end of the Jubilee, really. I want to see the tribute the vassals have brought. It might tell us something about the state of their loyalty. But that won't be for a month or more." She sighed. "I wish you had nothing to do with that man. And notice I say man. Man, not God. If the king refused to celebrate the feast of Ipet and receive a divine ka from the hand of Amun-Ra, for Nub-Nefer he was just a mortal like any other." Hani scratched his head dubiously. He wasn't sure what he thought about the king's divinity. It had never passed through his mind to question the late king's claims that he was Haru and Atum and Amun and even the Aten, but Neferkapura had crossed an irrevocable line in that regard. Hani was no longer sure how to address him. Eventually, Nub-Nefer drew back from Hani's arms. "Where are the others?" "They must be lingering outside. They were right on my heels." Sure enough, he heard voices and laughter in the vestibule, and in a moment his father, Mary Ra, burst in, followed by Maya, and guffawing and taunting each other, his second son, Pakiki, and his youngest girl, Neferet. The children were currently living in Akhenaten with their elder brother, Aha, but they came home for every holiday long enough for them to make the trip and back. Nebnefer opened her arms to embrace the youngsters, beaming with love. Pakiki hugged his mother, and Neferet threw herself on Nebnefer with her usual bruising enthusiasm. "How are your lessons going?" Nebnefer asked, running her fingers through Neferet's bangs. The 16-year-old was studying medicine with the royal physician of the royal harem. "It is so interesting, Mama," the girl cried. "We set a broken leg before I left. That's what I like, the hands-on sort of thing. Not all the testing for evil spirits or what angry ancestor is causing a disease." "You should be a military doctor," Mary Ra declared. "Nobody has to figure out where that hole in a soldier's middle came from." "I can't imagine a son that would become welcome on the battlefield, Father," Nebnefer said dryly. "Aren't military doctors all men?" "I think they are, but if you ask me, a woman would be more than welcomed by wounded soldiers." "Not my daughter," Nebnefer said firmly. "Speaking of the military, tell your mother your good news, Pakiki," Hani said, smiling. "I got a post with the army right here in Wasset," the boy cried. Hani thought of him as a boy even though he was 21 and married with a small child. Pakiki's cousin and wife, Nudjet, had borne him a son only the year before. Pakiki had been working in the Hall of Royal Correspondence, but he'd hankered for the more exciting life of a military scribe, as had his father and grandfather at that age. "That's wonderful, my dear," his mother hugged him again proudly. "It will be so nice to have you back in the city. You can start a real household now." "If I may point out, I had something to do with that post. I claimed right of succession when I retired, and since Hani didn't want the spot, I inscribed Pakiki for it." Mary Ra crossed his arms smugly over his broad chest. "I'm grateful, Grandfather," Pakiki assured him with exuberant sincerity. "But Nudjet is happy to have me back in Wasset." "Where are the girls?" He looked around hopefully. "Yes, where are they?" Maya echoed. His wife, Hani's daughter Sathuthara, was among the missing. "They've gone to Sathuthara's. They didn't expect you back this early," Nebnefer said. "Then I'm off, everyone," Maya said, turning on his heel. "Pakiki, I can send Nudjet back." "I'll go with you," Hani's son declared. "We'll probably go straight home from there. Mother, we'll see you tomorrow." The two young men strode off together toward the door, Maya's short steps pattering to catch up to Pakiki's. In a moment their clatter faded into the garden. Nebnefer smiled at her husband with fond warmth. "They're grown up and have their own families now." "Not me," Neferet said, throwing her arms around her mother. "It won't be long, my duckling," Hani told her affectionately. "You'll meet a nice young man and set up housekeeping like Sathuthara, and before long you'll have children too. Won't that be wonderful?" But Neferet's face fell, and she began to rock uneasily like a guilty child. She took on that stubborn look she got, and with her eyes shifting up to the side. "Does everybody have to get married and have children?" What a strange question, Hani thought, a little taken aback. He could see from Nebnefer's wide eyes that she too was shocked. "No one has to, but most people want to," he said, caressing his daughter's face. It is proper to make people happy, the man whose people are plenty. It's a joy to have a family." "Who will tend your tomb when you're gone, my love? No, you have to marry and have children," Nebnefer said in a tone that allowed no disagreement on the subject. But Neferet looked skeptical. Her lips stuck out. She was clearly fighting down an argument. Hani took in his daughter, really looking at her for the first time in a long while. At 16, she was a blocky, broad-shouldered girl who took after his side of the family. Not classically pretty, with her square face and gap-toothed grin, but so full of life and heart and self-confidence that no one noticed. Her little brown eyes were always sparkling. To him, she was as attractive as Sathuthara, who had inherited her mother's beauty and softly feminine figure. Have we not presented her with an example of happy family life? He wondered, pained. "Let's talk about that later," Neferet said brightly. "I want to see back at Isit." She left her baggage on the floor of the vestibule and darted into the salon to greet her oldest sister, who lay on her couch. Beckett Isset had been paralyzed in a horrible accident at the age of 15, toppling from the deck of a boat and breaking her back on the quay. If I'd never had children, I would have never known that strong and beautiful soul who happens to be my daughter. Hani was always moved by the thought of Beckett Isset. The fact was he couldn't imagine life without Nubneffer and the children. As the two of them stood face to face, Nubneffer shot him a disturbed and puzzled look. Then she said with a sigh, "I'll see about dinner." She turned and made her way through the salon, casting a bewildered glance at Nefret as she passed. Across the room, Hani heard his youngest regaling her sister with extravagant tales of life in the capital. He remembered how she used to act out everything Maya gave her to read and perform the secretary's stories of his travels, to the delight of the audience. She'd grown up a little, but there was still an effervescence about her that brightened everyone's day. "Never change, little duckling," he thought tenderly.